Hi everyone, and thank you for watching my presentation. My name is Anne Schmalstig, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Miami in Florida. My talk today is titled The Future is Wild: Speculative Evolution in the Post-Anthropocene. This presentation is part of my larger dissertation project about how the sublime has been used in climate fiction and how environmental speculative fiction and nonfiction utilize what I call slow resilience to help characters and readers deal with and adapt to changes that will occur with global climate change. More specifically, this talk comes from a chapter I'm working on about speculative nonfiction and documentary, and I put the non in nonfiction in parentheses, as I found that many of these texts, though categorized as nonfiction, were actually very fictional. While I will be focusing today solely on The Future is Wild, a BBC/Discovery Channel documentary series produced in the early 2000s, I am also looking at other speculative nonfiction texts like Alan Wiseman's The World Without Us, Roy Scranton's Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, and Anna L. Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. Each of these texts imagines a future world and operates within fictional parameters, though based on scientifically plausible evidence about the future evolution of our and other species. I have found that the sublime plays a significant role in environmental fiction and nonfiction texts, in which characters and readers are confronted with the devastating effects of real and projected global climate change. The sublime has a long, rich history in literature and art. Its definition as an aesthetic category was solidified in the 18th century by Immanuel Kant, and is a mixture of pain and pleasure when encountering something vast, infinite, powerful, or unexplainable. First, your reason is overwhelmed, and you experience awe and fear, as it is difficult to reconcile the greatness of what you're seeing with your previous experiences. A common example of this is rounding a bend in the road or on a path and being overwhelmed by the beauty of a huge waterfall or lofty mountain peak. This awe, however, is fleeting, as your reason takes over again, and you have a pleasurable feeling of superiority over the sublime object. Your brain has figured out how to classify it for you so you can master the experience. In the 20th and 21st centuries, literary critics have used the sublime to categorize experiences with human-made objects or forces, like nuclear power, or the global textile trade. Bruce Robbins wrote an article in PMLA in 2002 called The Sweatshop Sublime, about the experience you might have while putting on a t-shirt in the morning. You might fleetingly have a sense of the immense power of the system that sourced, produced, and distributed the t-shirt when you look at the tag, but then you would fail to wield any of that power as you return to your normal sense of the world, put on your shirt, and go on with your day. So what I'm interested in is seeing how climate fiction and nonfiction use the sublime when discussing characters' reactions to climate change, which is a huge, overwhelming, human-made force that's difficult to wrap one's head around, and might induce feelings of awe and fear when contemplating one's future within its effects. I've identified several sublime objects or experiences in environmental speculative fiction and nonfiction, including an extinction sublime. This is a sublime experience that occurs when contemplating the threat of mass human or non-human extinction in the near future, due to global warming, sea level rise, contamination of water and air, food shortages, etc. When characters in and readers of environmental speculative fiction and nonfiction imagine or are faced with such future disasters, they can either freeze in the initial awe-fear response, or they can make sense of them, adapt, and forge new ways of life. E. Ann Kaplan's 2015 book of literary and film criticism, Climate Trauma: Foreseeing the Future in Dystopian Film and Fiction, theorizes the awe-fear reaction readers and moviegoers might feel when engaging with imagined dystopian futures, and she calls this climate pre-trauma or pre-traumatic stress syndrome. This occurs when readers or viewers are, quote, invited to identify with future selves in uncertain, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable worlds, end quote. Imagining what seems like an impossibly bleak future can be demoralizing, if not immobilizing, and it is possible to be mired in despair without seeing a way forward. Or, a sublime experience with a dark future can serve as a warning for what should be avoided in reality. In the text I examine, I am interested not in the moments of despair, but in the creative ways characters, viewers, or readers respond to attritional, slow environmental violence with what I call slow resilience, which is an attention to the slow, vast, deep ways that humans, other species, and the planet itself show resilience in the face of environmental, social, and cultural degradation. Rather than getting their readers or viewers stuck in the first step of the sublime, the fear and awe, authors of environmental speculative fiction and nonfiction, including the producers of The Future is Wild, set up new worlds where it is possible for its inhabitants to thrive and find new ways of living. One nonfiction response to climate change is despair for or dismissal of the human race, but hope for the rest of the planet, as detailed in the BBC's documentary The Future is Wild. This series digitally animates wild but plausible futures where humans have suddenly disappeared and new hybrid creatures with names like Flish and Cryptiles will flourish. I will theorize how the choice to completely remove humanity from the equation relates to thinking about slow resilience in terms of other species, and how sidestepping the emotional toll of examining humanity's apocalyptic end can be intellectually productive. By examining the futuristic settings, narrative and rhetorical strategies, and use of scientific nonfiction and documentary tropes, I will argue that The Future is Wild purposely avoids engaging with humanity's role in global climate change and the huge burden of guilt that would otherwise be placed on humanity's shoulders for a reckless disregard for the environment. Rather than forcing readers and viewers to confront and devise solutions to these admittedly daunting issues, the producers of this documentary construct a strangely comforting world where humans have simply vanished. While this ignores the widespread and long-lasting environmental impact of Anthropocenic climate change on the rest of the planet, it also suggests a way for us to think about the future of the planet in terms of the resilience of other species. The BBC/Discovery Channel's documentary operates within rather unusual generic and temporal parameters. Brent Bellamy and Imre Sisman have created a very specific category for texts like these, and they call this science faction. And this form includes books as well as documentaries, and they specifically mention The Future is Wild. So they define science faction as, quote, quasi-scientific, quasi-science fictional texts that depict the world after the final collapse of civilization and the extinction of the human race, often at hyperbolic geologic timescales extending millions of years, end quote. The temporal range of The Future is Wild fits neatly in this category. The film barely mentions humanity and does not account for its demise, and projects other species' evolution into futures 5, 100, and 200 million years from now. This temporal shift into the future, coupled with, quote, landscapes devoid of people, causes an immediate challenge to narrative logic, according to Bellamy and Sisman. Such leaps are accounted for in science fiction through Darko Suvin's term, cognitive estrangement. This occurs when audiences are estranged from the present reality, but also given an explanation for the change based on current or plausible-sounding science, versus fantasy where cognitive logic and reason are rejected. Or, as Bellamy and Sisman put it, cognitive estrangement allows a science fiction text to, quote, account rationally for its imagined world and for the connections and disconnections of the latter to our own empirical world, end quote. Science faction, though playing out the consequences of new scenarios and technologies, does not explain its narrative, temporal, and technological leaps, and so is even farther removed from traditional science fiction and its offshoot speculative fiction. Bellamy and Sisman also know that such texts, like science documentaries, quote, tend to displace questions about narrator, addressee, or audience, and often manifest as didactic teaching of fact, science, and environmental politics, adopting a documentary form dominated by its presumed immediate relation to the real. This is precisely what happens in The Future is Wild. The documentary has an authoritative-sounding male narrator who opens the series by addressing human viewers who he is about to say have gone extinct. He says, "Today, planet Earth is dominated by humans. There are over 6 billion of us. But what would happen to the planet if there were no people? Just imagine that people were to disappear from this world. Many familiar animals, the big cats, the bears, the wolves, already endangered, already under threat from us, will disappear in a few thousand years. The planet and their survivors will carry on without us, evolution, natural selection will create new and bizarre life. This short setup, with a series' only mention of humanity and its casual dismissal, is communicated via voiceover, while time-lapse video is shown of people driving cars in cities to minimal music, in the style of Ron Frick's cinematography in Koyaanisqatsi and Baraka. This short half-minute clip is the only time people and the marks of their civilization are presented on screen. After a fade to white, humanity, and a few short clips of animals alive but endangered today, is replaced by quick flashes of the digitally animated, imagined future animals that will be presented throughout the series. The words "Welcome to the future" appear on screen, and the narrator begins talking in the present tense, although he is narrating a time 5 million years from now. These future worlds are populated by strange creatures. These first few minutes of the series establish a negative attitude about humanity, in which humans' only representation on screen is situated in a frenetic, overpopulated, overdeveloped cityscape, and the only commentary provided on the human race is that it has caused other species to be endangered. The cinematic and musical nod to Frick's films compounds the life out of balance feel to the sequence, and the narrator summarily dismisses the entire human civilization to focus on the strange new creatures of the future. As the first episode continues, the narrator, with the help of several evolutionary scientists, explains how the climate of the Earth will change and how the continents will gradually move back together. This will allow all kinds of new life to evolve in the environments created. The narrator speaks about each new environment, first in the past tense, as if the environmental changes narrated have already occurred. For example, in the dry Ice Age climate, the vast Amazon rainforest died out to be replaced by grass. When the new time and environment is established, the narrator switches to the present tense, but there are predators here as well. When that environment with its new predators is fully described, the narrator then switches to future tense to introduce a later time in a different place on the planet. These tense changes and the cursory dismissal of humanity make it difficult to understand who the narrator is addressing. If viewers are situated in the futures being described, then according to the premise of the series, humans are already gone, and the narrator has no one to talk to. However, situating itself past some unidentified end for humanity, the documentary's unusual use of time actually serves to soften the blow of the end of human civilization. The lack of human survivors, besides scientist interviewees who hover somewhere between the present and the humanless future, and the leaps between past, present, and future, disjoint viewers from a linear, end-oriented time frame. The focus of the documentary thus becomes less anthropocentric and more concentrated on non-human life that could flourish without us. The biologists, paleontologists, geologists, and anthropologists who provide testimony about future species on Earth speak about past geologic events and the possibility of the new species discussed, lending a more documentary tone to the series. They are situated in the present, the time the series was produced, but discuss the potential results of evolution in the future. Each scientist sits or stands in front of a green screen, while multiple screen graphics depicting digitally animated future environments are projected behind them. Each scientist, all of whom are white and male, is identified in the lower third of the screen by title, name, and academic affiliation, lending credence to their testimony. While the presence of evolutionary scientists adds credibility to the documentary, the lack of diversity among the interviewees suggests that the future, much like the past, will be narrated by white men. Despite the fact that humans in this imagined future are long gone, the legacies of racism and sexism apparently live on in this new humanless world. In addition to the choice to have white male scientists narrate a future devoid of humanity, the fact that the interviewer and the questions asked are not seen or heard further obscures who the series' audience is. Despite these confusing elements, the style of interview used is common in many science and environmental documentaries, and documentaries in general, and presents the series as a more traditional nature documentary with expert testimony from scientists in related fields. The scientist interviewees lend scientific weight and plausibility to the series' fictional future animals, even as they further remove the series from a clearly demarcated temporal setting. Another quality that separates The Future is Wild from traditional nature documentary is the series' digital animations of its imagined future creatures. While the documentary has a hybrid narrative form that walks a fine line between fact and fiction, or science and science fiction, the documentary further removes its viewers from reality with its fabricated documentary video footage. For example, one of the creatures imagined in a post-future ice age 5 million years from now is called a Griken, as in this slide. This creature lives, so the narrator tells us, on what is now the bare, rocky plateaus of Cyprus, Malta, and Crete, which have dried up and turned into salt flats, making the islands into mountains in a desert climate. The Griken is first shown from a close-up and then a medium close-up as it crawls along rocky ground past a stationary camera. Then the camera switches to a point-of-view shot of the rocky ground the Griken is crawling through, as if a camera is attached to the Griken's head. These are common nature documentary shots, which allow viewers to watch the subject from both the perspective of the filmmaker, presumably sitting a few feet away from the action, and of the subject through a body cam. However, like the Griken itself, these shots are entirely fabricated, digitally created on a computer in a studio. The effect of making only a cursory mention of humanity through a short clip of cityscapes at the beginning of the first episode is dismissive of both the humans and other species that are now and will be affected by Anthropocene climate change. The first episode mentions a few species that have been endangered by humans already, but brings them up only to relegate them to the past as well. The narrator notes that by 5 million years in the future, the first time period explored by the series, already endangered species will be long gone. And of course, by removing humans from the picture after the first few minutes, it becomes both unnecessary and impossible to deal with any issues of environmental justice that already plague vulnerable human populations in the real world. Such issues are swept neatly aside by the documentary's speculative temporal leap into a humanless future. However, for all its flaws and eccentricities, The Future is Wild imagines future times where other species flourish. In each episode, a new kind of environment is described, one that will be created through a complex series of weather and geological changes over time. Again, the series ignores how the natural cycles of warming and cooling of the planet are already being unnaturally sped up by Anthropocenic climate change. However, it is reassuring to be reminded that the Earth has gone and will go through many environmental changes in coming millennia. Humans may have caused unprecedented environmental destruction and changes during our time on Earth, but like many other species that have existed before us, we too will pass into the fossil record of the planet, and life will continue without us. Ultimately, the documentary deliberately avoids making its audience experience any fear of or sense of responsibility for Anthropocenic climate change and environmental degradation. However, it provides comforting information about how the planet will slowly change over time and how other species, like the megasquid, will adapt resiliently with or without us. The documentary is also an unusual hybrid combination of science and fiction, or science faction, in that it includes unexplained narrative, verb tense, and temporal leaps between the past, present, and future. While other works of environmental speculative nonfiction, perhaps heavy-handedly, emphasize dire doomsday scenarios and the necessity of facing humanity's demise head-on, The Future is Wild purposely and completely prevents its audiences from having to consider them. Its unusual combination of scientific testimony and fantastical premise serves to remove its viewers from being mired in debilitating apocalyptic thinking and lamentations for the end of humanity. Instead, the slow resilience of the planet and its non-human species is emphasized and celebrated. Thank you.